Now, for the African continent to develop and match its enormous potentialities, it is imperative that they shore up their energy needs in an efficient manner to meet present and future requirements. Experts are of the opinion that part of the strategies will be formulating an energy module that is both affordable and renewable. A few stakeholders in the energy sector are not just thinking but working hard in this regard. One of such is Monica Maduekwe, fondly called the Amazon of renewable energy in Africa, and she joins me now on World Now. Thank you so much for joining us on World Now, Mrs. Monica.
Thank you very much for having me.
Great. Regarding the suggestion that Africa urgently needs to turn away from its oil and gas assets because it's seen as a problem for climate change by those who argue that the different regions of the world need to be on a declining pathway for carbon dioxide emissions. Do you think these demands are well informed?
Actually, we do not think it's well informed. We've seen some kind of strong arm tactics insisting that Africa must stop investing in its oil and gas assets urgently, as if it's possible to immediately turn away from an energy system that relies on fossil fuel. So what we did during the COP26 was to provide an objective analysis that laid out what was happening in different economies. These are advanced economies like the UK, Europe, and the United States, as well as emerging economies like China, and looking at what is happening in Africa to provide objective arguments that the demands are not well informed.
Great, but as things stand, it's said that the net zero 2050 carbon neutrality targets will not work for Africa. Even more developed climes, such as the Chinese and the Saudis, have proposed and adopted a 2060 target, which I think looks more like a target Africa should adopt, shouldn't it?
Well, you're right. And for us, it's not just whether it's 2050, 2060, or 2070. It actually depends on certain conditions being met. And this was what we did in that report. We looked at 3 conditions. We looked at technical feasibility and grid stability as number 1. We looked at environmental concerns, and we looked at the issue of energy security and energy cost. And we looked at how this is influencing energy choices. We looked at also the issue of investment. And in generally, we are saying that in order for Africa to get to a carbon neutrality position, either by 2060, 2070, or even 2050, we have to look at the issue of investment. If we have the necessary investment in infrastructure, that's in terms of having clean fuels in our energy system, having interconnections, grids connecting different countries, and other solutions, definitely we can fast track our goal of carbon neutrality. So whether it's 2060 or 2070, it all depends on those conditions being met. And we are saying that it's important that the world comes together to make sure that at least by 2060, those conditions are met in order for us to join the world in achieving net zero emissions. Right,
well, makes sense, I would say. But you've also basically said in your discussion paper that Africa is doing better than the Western world in terms of renewable energy utilization. How, if I may ask?
Africa is doing really well. Most of the times the arguments you hear is that Africa is behind, Africa isn't doing well. But when you look at the energy mix, you see that about 20% of energy sources for electricity generation comes from renewables. Of course, this is predominantly hydroelectricity, but it's because we are challenged in terms of our grid's capacity to increase solar and wind, which are intermittent sources of energy. So we've argued and showed how in order to increase wind and solar, we need to really invest in infrastructure. We need to invest in better management of our grid systems and other conditions we've noted in that report. So Africa is doing really well. And of course, you have Europe having over 30% of renewable in their energy mix. Right. This is because Europe has the kind of infrastructure that makes it possible for you to integrate variable renewable energy sources like solar and wind. And they also they're investing seriously in energy storage. They're investing seriously in interconnections, among other infrastructures.
Well, it's one thing to have lofty ideas, enormous potentialities. It's much of another thing to attract investors. How willing are these investors in putting their money on the African project, as certain Western countries have been disparaging foreign investors from investing in oil and gas assets in Africa, claiming that they might end up with stranded assets in the future? How do you react to this?
This is a very, very misformed argument. First of all, if you look at the energy sector in Africa, that is very energy poor. By investing in the sector, whether it's in oil and gas, you can help countries to develop economically. And by developing economically, then we can transition quickly into cleaner energy forms and having the necessary infrastructure to integrate cleaner energy technologies in our system. So those are very wrong arguments, and we think it's not fair to withhold the necessary capital from African countries necessary for them to develop. So we think that it's important that Africa chooses the right investors, the right financiers. These are people that are interested in Africa's development, and they are not just looking at whether the project today is mitigating carbon emissions, is mitigating climate change, but they are looking at the trajectory. Can this project lead to development, lead to sustainable development that will enable Africans to have cleaner and modern forms of energy services, as well as have the economic capacity to invest heavily in cleaner technologies? We also need to look at the issue of manufacturing. Africa needs to manufacture its own technologies, its energy technologies. If we're talking about moving towards wind and solar, and we're importing all this from other economies, we are doing ourselves a disservice. So we see that generally economic growth is important in order for Africa to transition to a net zero emissions economy.
Final thoughts on the fact that if all of these things are to be considered, really have to get Africa right on track to be, get going to ensure that Africa is developed and is at par with other developed nations. So who should be having this conversation? Apart from somebody like you, who is an expert, do you also look at other, international communities, talk about also the African government, etc., etc.? Who are the people that should be having this conversation?
Well, the onus lies on the African government, our African policymakers. They need to choose rightly in terms of how they want to transition. We need to choose least cost options. So we should not go for the most expensive technologies. We saw in our analysis in that report that advanced economies are going for least cost options. So advanced economies are prioritizing economics and the economy, meaning that they are looking at their scarce resources and looking at how they can manage this to achieve the best outcome for their economy. So African policymakers need to be on the table. They need to take charge of this. They need to be the ones negotiating what is best for them. Secondly, we need African financiers. We're talking about big financiers like Afrexim Bank, AFC, the African Development Bank. These are the ones that will come together to say, look, we know that Africa cannot immediately turn away from its oil and gas assets, but we know that in the next 20, 30, 40 years, it's possible if we invest in certain technologies today, in certain infrastructure, in certain industries, in certain economic development projects, that Africa can get to carbon neutrality in the next 40, 50 years, or whenever it's possible in terms of these conditions being met. Well, so the financiers and, of course, the private sector, those who will be implementing projects.
Well, we'll keep having these global conversations and see how, these important actors bring the dreams or our dreams to fruition. Amazon of renewable energy in Africa, Monica Maduekwe. What a wonderful description. Thank you so much for speaking with World Now.
Thank you.